Picture a dressing room. Somewhere in the early 1950s. New York. A woman stands before a mirror. She is Billie Holiday, the greatest jazz singer America has ever produced. A voice so singular that Frank Sinatra will spend the rest of his life trying to explain what she did to a note and failing. She is getting ready to perform. And before she puts on the gardenias and the gown, she wraps her ribs tightly, the way you wrap a broken thing that still has to work. Her husband beat her. He knew exactly where to hit, the body, the ribs, the places the audience could not see. She went out and sang anyway, every night, with bound ribs and a government that had been following her for 15 years and a habit they had helped engineer and a voice that somehow, impossibly, was still there. Here is the question the record never fully answers. How did a woman this powerful end up here? Not the obvious answer. Not poverty, not addiction, not racism, though all three are present in every page of this story. The specific answer, the mechanism, the exact sequence of decisions and betrayals and threads pulled loose, one, by men who understood precisely what they were doing. One thread came loose first. It was small. Nobody fixed it. Everything after was connected to that. One thread came loose. Old money women follow it all the way. Subscribe so the unraveling is never forgotten. To understand what came apart, you have to first understand what was standing. By the early 1940s, Billie Holiday had built something extraordinary, not just a career, but a structure. A life that functioned. A life that held. She had come up from nothing. A Baltimore childhood spent in poverty, assaulted at 9, committed to a Catholic reform school, cleaning rooms in a brothel alongside her mother before she was a teenager. She had emerged from all of it with a voice that could do things no other voice could do, and she had used that voice to build something real. That is the part people forge. How much she had actually built and how deliberately before any of it started coming apart. The financial thread was the first layer. She was performing at the top venues in New York, recording for major labels, touring with her own musicians. She had a manager, Joe Glazer, who handled the business. She was earning, at the height of her power, serious money, enough that she had options. She could leave a booking that disrespected her. She could turn down a promoter. She could walk away from a man who showed her what he was made of, because she was not financially dependent on any one person. That is what money does when it is truly yours. It gives you the door. The social thread ran deeper than fame. Her name on a marquee meant something specific. She had been playing with Count Basie's orchestra, recording with Teddy Wilson, performing at Café Society, New York's first racially integrated nightclub, since the late 1930s. And in 1939, at Café Society, she had done something no performer in America had done before. She stood in the dark, the lights off, the waiters instructed to stop moving, and she sang Strange Fruit, a song about lynching, about black bodies hanging from southern trees. She sang it to a room of white New Yorkers, and when it ended, they sat in silence. Not polite silence. The silence of people who had just understood something they had been carefully not understanding. That was what the social thread was made of. It was not just popularity. It was consequence. It was the particular, irreplaceable weight of a voice that had changed what a room full of people knew about the world. But the thread that held everything else, the one no one would have named as the critical thread, because it had never been tested, was the sobriety thread. Not total sobriety. She drank heavily. She smoked marijuana. She was never what anyone would call cautious about her pleasures. But she had not touched heroin. Her first husband, trombonist Jimmy Monroe, had introduced her to opium. She had seen what heroin did to the musicians around her, the careers it had hollowed, the talent it had swallowed. She had decided, in the specific and deliberate way a woman decides such things, that this was the line she would not cross. That decision, that thread, was holding things she could not see it holding. Without heroin in her life, the financial thread had no vulnerability that could be exploited from the inside. Without heroin, the men around her were men she could assess clearly and leave if necessary. Without heroin, she could not be arrested. Without heroin, Harry Anslinger, who had been watching her since the night she first sang Strange Fruit, and had decided she was a problem he intended to solve, had nothing to work with. The sobriety thread was the thread that made all the others possible. It looked the strongest because it had always held. She had been surrounded by addiction for years and had not crossed that line. The financial thread, the social thread, the personal thread, each of them had taken years to construct, and each had been built in conditions that offered no assistance. The financial thread was the product of a decade of performing in rooms that did not treat her as a full human being, building a name and a rate that the club owners eventually had no choice but to meet. The social thread had been built on the specific courage of standing in a dark room in 1939 and singing a song that could have ended everything and instead made her permanent. The personal thread, the knowledge of who she was when she walked onto a stage, had been forged in a childhood that had tried, repeatedly, to destroy it before she was old enough to know she had it. Everything was holding. That is the hardest part to understand. Looking back, everything was holding. His name was Joe Guy. He was 24 years old, a trumpet player from Birmingham, Alabama, who had come north to Harlem and made a real name for himself in He bebop circles reshaping jazz in the mid-1940s. He had played with Dizzy Gillespie. He was talented and handsome and, according to every biographical account of this period, a heroin addict. Around 1944, he and Billie Holiday became involved. He became her romantic partner and, informally, the manager of her touring operation. He was 5 years her junior. She was 30, exhausted, and already wearier of the world than he was. But Joe Guy was young and full of ideas and he could play, and she let him in. He introduced her to heroin. That is in the record, plainly. Her first husband Monroe had introduced her to opium years earlier, but heroin was Joe Guy. The needle was Joe Guy. Holiday crossed the line she had held for years sometime around 1944 with him, and once she crossed it, the thread of sobriety that had been holding everything else was gone. Not fraying. Gone. You cannot recross a line like that from the outside. He pulled one thread. He may not have understood what was attached to it. That does not change what came apart. The question I kept returning to, reading through the court documents and the newspaper accounts and the testimony collected across the 1970s, was not what Joe Guy did. It was what he wanted. Men like Joe Guy did not come to watch something be built. They arrived at a life that was already valuable and they found the vulnerability. The earnings of a woman at the height of her powers. The name that opened rooms. These were things that could be borrowed against, drawn down, used up. He used them. When he had finished using them, he moved on. I traced this unraveling through 14 documents across 3 archives, the Kuehl interviews, the court records from the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the New York Amsterdam News reporting from 1947, the biographical accounts of Stuart Nicholson and Julia Blackburn, the testimony of musicians and agents and managers who were present in those rooms. Every thread is accounted for. What I could not account for at first was this. When Guy was arrested alongside Holiday in 1947, charged with receiving and concealing a narcotic drug, she testified in a way that protected him. She put all of it on herself. The jury deliberated 1 hour and found him innocent. He walked out. She stayed. Why did she do that? The New York Amsterdam News ran the headline after the verdict. Billie Holiday's mate freed, word from blues singer, would have landed Joe Guy in pen. The implication was plain. She had the testimony to convict him. She chose not to give it. The question is not whether she did this, she did. The question is what it reveals about the nature of the thread he had pulled. Because you do not protect a man who has simply wronged you. You protect a man who has become structurally necessary to you. You protect a man when leaving him, even in a courtroom, even at enormous personal cost. Feels more dangerous than staying. The habit had made him necessary. That is what I took the longest to understand. The first thread going loose, in retrospect, was not an accident. And by 1947 it had already done its work so completely that she was willing to take a federal conviction to keep him from a cell. He walked out. He moved to 129th Street. As far as every biographer has been able to determine, he never appeared in Billie Holiday's life again. He had left her with the habit and taken the exit. The habit was now hers alone. And with the habit came everything the habit would attract. What came loose first was not the arrest. The arrest came later. What came loose first was the room. A heroin habit does not destroy a life the way a hurricane does, all at once, from outside. It reorganizes it from within. The first question of every morning stops being what do I want and becomes what do I need and who controls access to it. That reorganization is the first pull. It is quiet. It is internal. It is invisible to everyone watching from outside, and almost invisible to he person it is happening to because each individual day looks more or less like the day before. What the habit pulled was Holiday's judgment about the men in her orbit. This is the connection the record makes plain. A woman with money and options and the ability to leave has a fundamentally different relationship to the people around her than a woman who needs something they can provide. Once the habit was in place, the men who offered supply had a power over her that had nothing to do with charm or talent or romantic feeling. It was structural power, the kind that does not declare itself, the kind that simply waits. Joe Guy had been supplying. When he disappeared to 129th Street after the trial, the supply chain moved to whoever came next in the sequence. What came next was a series of men, managers, club owners, a mob enforcer who would eventually become her husband, who understood, with varying degrees of consciousness, that they were not managing a jazz singer. They were managing a dependency. And the dependency was the lever they could press any time they needed something from her. This is the pull that everything subsequent depended on. Not the government, not Anslinger. The pull was inside the room, in the quiet daily accounting of a life in which something that had always been hers was slowly becoming something she had to earn back, day by day, from people whose interests had never been identical to hers. And outside the room, watching all of it, was a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Harry Anslinger had been the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics since 1930. He had attended to Billie Holiday since 1939, since the first night she sang Strange Fruit and made a room full of white Americans sit in silence. He had sent threatening messages to the venue. He had communicated, through channels that powerful men use when they prefer not to be quoted, that the song should stop. She had refused. She kept singing it. For 5 years. He kept singing it, and there was nothing Anslinger could legally do to a woman who had not crossed the line he needed her to cross. He had been patient. The record shows this in the specific way that bureaucratic patience shows itself, in memos, in surveillance reports, in the assignment of a young black agent named Jimmy Fletcher to document her movements in Harlem. Anslinger didn't like hiring black agents. He made an exception for Holiday because the work needed to be done from inside her world, and inside her world, a white agent would have lasted a week. So he made the exception. He filed the reports. He waited. Now she had crossed it. What thread one pulled when it went, that is where the unraveling actually began. But the government did not start the pull. A 24-year-old trumpet player from Birmingham did, with a needle in a room in 1944. And Anslinger had simply been patient enough to wait for someone like Joe Guy to come along. Thread 1, the sobriety thread, had been holding the independence thread. And the independence thread was the one nobody had thought to name. Independence, for a black woman performer in 1940s America, was not a philosophical state. It was a daily, practical, expensive thing to maintain. It meant the ability to look at a manager who was skimming from her and say no. It meant the ability to look at a man who showed her who he was and leave. It required clear eyes, and clear eyes required the particular kind of solidity that a heroin habit specifically structurally erodes. Not will, not intelligence, not talent, solidity, the ability to hold your position when the people around you are applying pressure. When the sobriety thread went, the independence thread had nothing holding it. Thread 2 was the independence thread. And thread 2 pulled the financial thread. Thread 2 could not hold without thread 1. That connection had always been there. Nobody had seen it while everything was holding. The financial thread Dee looked robust, the earnings of an artist at the top of her field. But those earnings were only hers as long as she had the independence to protect them. With the independence thread gone, the men around her moved into the space it had occupied. Joe Glazer, her longtime manager, was taking his substantial percentage. The touring money was going to the habit and to the people managing the habit. And then, after the 1947 conviction, a club owner named John Levy walked in. Levy has been described, across multiple accounts, as a man who had acquired his business knowledge as a pimp. He ran Club Ebony, one of the few New York venues Holiday could access after losing her cabaret card. He withheld money owed to her. He used her name and earnings to run operations she had no oversight of. And in early 1949, in San Francisco, according to accounts consistent with the historical record, he arranged the next act. An agent from Anslinger's bureau arrived at Holiday's room at the Mark Twain Hotel and found what he called evidence of narcotics. Holiday said she had been clean. Multiple accounts suggest the evidence was planted. She was arrested regardless, charged again, broken again. The financial thread went when Levy finished with it. Thread 3 was the professional thread, and this one Anslinger held the scissors for himself. In New York City, performing anywhere that served alcohol required a cabaret card, a license issued by the NYPD. A felony drug conviction made you ineligible. After Holiday's 1947 conviction, after 10 months at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia, where she had actually gotten clean, had actually accomplished what she'd asked the judge to let her do. She walked back into New York and, in March of 1948, sold out Carnegie Hall. That is documented fact. A triumph of the voice at exactly the moment the government had intended to finish her. But she could not get the cabaret card back. Not the clubs. Not the intimate rooms Air Jazz lived, where a voice like hers was heard the way it was meant to be heard. She could fill concert halls. She could tour Europe. But the city that had made her was closed to her in the specific way that mattered most. And that closure forced her into the arms of the men who could navigate what she now had access to, the men outside the legitimate club system, the men whose access came at a price she did not fully understand until she was already paying it. The professional thread gone. The financial thread gone. The independence thread gone. And now, through the narrowed circle of people she could rely on, came the man who would do the specific thing the title of this video describes. Louis Mackay. Mackay came into her life in the early 1950s. He had worked, according to multiple accounts, as a mob enforcer. He became her road manager. In 1957, after they were both arrested for narcotics possession in 1956, he became her husband married in Mexico, because the state of New York was no longer a place where things went easily for Billie Holiday. He described himself as the man who was taking care of her. What he was doing, the record is precise about, was beating her on her ribs, on her body, on the places where the bruising would be covered by the gown she wore on stage. He hit her in the places that would not show. She taped her ribs before shows. Sit with that for a moment. The greatest jazz singer in America, the woman whose voice had stopped rooms cold, whose recordings Frank Sinatra would study for the rest of his life, whose particular way of leaning into the back of a note could make a theater full of people feel that she was singing directly to someone they had never spoken aloud, stood in her dressing room before performances and wrapped her fractured ribs and walked out and sang. Every night, with the tape pulled tight under the gown, with the gardenia in her hair that had become her trademark, the flower placed precisely where it always was, so that from the front of the house everything looked as it had always looked. This is the specific detail that the title of this video reaches for. Not for shock, for precision, because the taped ribs are the exact physical image of what was happening to the whole structure of her life. Damaged in the places that didn't show, held together just well enough to perform, unmistakably breaking underneath. Mackay could take the money and Anslinger could take the cabaret card and Levy could take the earnings and Jogai could take the decade. But none of them could take what happened when she opened her mouth. That was why she kept going back to the stage. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though by the mid-1950s that was becoming true too. Because singing was the one thing in her life that required only her. No manager, no cabaret card, no supply chain. Every other thread ran through someone else's hands. The voice ran through no one's hands but her own. And as long as she could hold it, there was still something in her life that was genuinely, irreducibly hers. That was the last thread. The one she held herself. She held it through Mackay's violence. She held it through the 1958 album Lady in Satin, on which her voice carries every year of what had been done to it, rougher, slower, more harrowed than the voice of the 1930s, and is still unmistakably, irreplaceably hers. She was still carrying it in February 1959 when Lester Young, Her oldest friend in music, the man who had named her Lady Day, died, and Young's wife refused to let Holiday sing at the funeral. She held through the grief of that, through the particular cruelty of that. She held the last thread herself, for longer than anyone knew. When it went, not because of McKay, not because of a single act of violence, but because 44 years of addiction and abuse had used up what a body could carry. She collapsed in her apartment on May 31, 1959. There was nothing left to hold. The first repair attempt was the plea itself, standing before the judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in 1947 and asking, not for acquittal but for help. She had signed away her right to a lawyer. Her manager had refused to arrange counsel. She had not fully understood what the signature meant. But what she said to the judge, what the court record captures, was not a legal argument. It was a medical one. She told the court she had a drug problem. She wanted to be sent somewhere she could address it. She understood with complete clarity that this was an illness, and she asked a federal judge to treat it as one. That repair required a government that was not actively invested in her destruction. The judge sentenced her to a year and a day at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia. She served 10 months. She came out clean. She had, inside those walls, actually managed to rethread the sobriety thread, the very first thread that had come loose. When she walked out of Alderson in March 1948, the thing she had asked for, the repair she had requested, had technically been accomplished. That is not what the story usually emphasizes. But the repair could not hold. Not because she had failed inside the prison. Because of what the unraveling had already taken that sobriety needed to survive on the outside. To hold the sobriety thread in place, she needed the cabaret card that had been revoked. She needed the financial stability that Levy would finish dismantling. She needed the circle of people around her to be smaller and cleaner than the circle that was waiting when she came home. None of those things existed anymore. She came out clean and walked back into the same room. The failed repair showed her something about the original structure she had not been able to see while it was holding. The sobriety thread had never been independent. It had been supported by every other thread. Without them, it could not stand alone. The second repair attempt was Carnegie Hall. In March of 1948, weeks out of prison, no cabaret card, the financial thread already compromised. She sold out Carnegie Hall. Not a polite success. Not a sympathy crowd. The accounts from the musicians and journalists present that night describe an audience that understood it was witnessing something that should not have been possible. She sang as though the previous year had happened to someone else. As though she had decided that the voice, stripped of everything else, was the only argument that still mattered. That repair required a music industry willing to organize itself around what that night had demonstrated. Willing to build a structure that did not depend on the cabaret system Anslinger had locked her out of. It required management that was working for her. The person who could have made that repair hold did not exist inside her orbit. The voice was there. The architecture to protect it was not. The failure of the Carnegie Hall repair revealed something else. The voice was the deepest thread, the one that could be rethreaded from within, alone, without anyone's help. She had proven that. What she could not do alone was rethread the structure around it. And without that structure, the voice alone was not enough to keep the men at bay. The repair that almost held was Europe. In the mid-1950s, she toured England and France. In those rooms, London, Paris, she was not a convicted felon whose government had spent 15 years working to destroy her. She was what she had been before any of this started. An artist of the first order, performing for audiences who came because of what she could do and left changed by what she had done. There are photographs from those European tours that are unlike almost any photographs of her from the American years of that decade. In them, she looks, and the word is not complicated, free. Like the constant low-level pressure of being a target had, at least temporarily, lifted. The financial thread was beginning to wreck. Unstruct. She had bookings she controlled. She had earnings she could hold. The professional thread was gathering itself in a form that did not depend on an NYPD license. Distance from Anslinger's bureau, from the men who controlled the supply, from the specific geography of New York where every familiar corner held someone who knew what she needed and was willing to provide it at a price. The distance was doing what no repair attempt on American soil had been able to do. The repair almost held. What came loose at the last moment was Louis McKay. He was waiting when she came back. Patient in the way that men who understand leverage are patient. Not needy, not dramatic, simply present in the place she returned to. The habit followed her home, and he was there when it arrived. What she understood when she stopped trying, sometime in the late 1950s, the evidence of it visible in the quieter choices the record shows from those years, was not defeat. It was something more precise than defeat. It was understanding. The threads had never been independent of each other, and the world she was operating in had been specifically designed to ensure that a woman with her particular vulnerabilities could not hold all of them simultaneously. The fault was not in any single thread. The fault had been built into the original construction of a life lived as a black woman with an addiction in a country whose most powerful drug enforcement officer had decided, in 1939, that she was a problem he intended to solve. She had not built the fault. The fault had been built around her. She did not stop performing. That matters. She kept singing because the voice was the one thread that required only her. The one repair she could make entirely alone, from inside, without anyone's cooperation. She brought it to whatever stage would have her, through the 1950s, through McKay's violence and the government's surveillance and the closing of the rooms she had loved. What she understood by the end was that the repair of everything else would never be complete. Not because of anything she had failed to do, but because of who had been given access to pull the first thread, and who had been patient enough to wait for someone exactly like Joe Guy to come along. Metropolitan Hospital, New York City, May 31, 1959. She had collapsed at home. Her friends had brought her in. The admitting physician found liver disease, heart failure, the accumulated weight of more than a decade of heroin and alcohol, and the specific damage a man inflicts when he hits a woman in the places that will not show. She was placed in an oxygen tent. She was given methadone. And, according to the people who were with her in those weeks, she began to get better. She gained weight. She talked about going home. She was 44 years old, and she was going to survive this. On June 12, 1959, 12 days into her recovery, the police arrived at Metropolitan Hospital and searched her room. They found a small tinfoil packet containing less than 1/8 of an ounce of heroin. Whether a visitor had brought it in, or whether it had been placed there by the officers conducting the search, is a question the record has never definitively answered. What the record confirms is what followed. She was charged with narcotics possession. She was too weak to be taken into custody. So they did the next available thing. They stationed police guards outside her door, removed the flowers someone had brought, removed the radio, removed the record player, and, according to multiple accounts, handcuffed her to the hospital bed. They fingerprinted her. They photographed her. They interrogated her without a lawyer present. Outside the hospital, people held signs that read, "Let Lady Day live." Anslinger's office ordered her methadone cut off after 10 days. The methadone was the repair. When it was cut, there was nothing left to hold. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959. Cirrhosis of the liver. Heart failure. He had 70 cents in her bank account. She had $750 strapped to her leg to pay the nurses who had taken care of her. Now return to the first thread. Joe Guy. A room in Harlem. Sometime around 1944. A woman who had survived everything the world had sent at her. The assault at 9, the reform school, the brothel, the first husband who had already cost her more than she should have paid. The decade of Jim Crow indignities on the road with white orchestras who would introduce her from the stage and then refuse to let her use the front entrance. Deciding, in some quiet ordinary moment, to let one more man through the door. He was 24. He played trumpet. He was handsome and talented, and he had ideas about music that the best musicians of his generation respected. She let him in. He introduced her to heroin. 3 years later, she sat in a federal courtroom in Philadelphia and gave testimony that walked him out the door and locked her inside. He moved to 129th Street. He disappeared from every record that followed. That was the thread. And what it was holding, what could not be seen while it was holding because the whole structure was still intact, was the entire sequence that followed. The sobriety thread held the independence thread. The independence thread held the financial thread. The financial thread held the professional thread. The professional thread held the physical safety that a properly functioning career could have provided. The practical ability, grounded in economic reality, to leave a man like Louis McKay before he got close enough that she was taping her ribs before performances. Each thread depended on the one before it. The chain was invisible when the threads were holding. It only became visible when they were gone. She knew this by the end. Not as a theory. In the specific, bodily way you know the shape of a room you have been locked inside and cannot leave. What the record also makes clear, in the decisions she kept making until her body refused to cooperate, was that none of what happened to her was inevitable. The thread had been small, could have held. There had been a window in 1944 when someone might have fixed it. Nobody fixed it, and what came after could not be stopped. 3 threads survived. The first was the recordings. Not her voice. Her voice was gone when she died at 44, taken by the same accumulation of damage that had taken everything else. But the recordings were pressed into shellac and vinyl and wax, and no federal bureau had jurisdiction over them. Anslinger could take the cabaret card. He could cut the methadone. He could station 2 officers at the door of a hospital room and photograph a dying woman in handcuffs. He could not touch the 1930s sessions with Teddy Wilson, the 1944 Commodore recordings, the final rawness of Lady in Satin in 1958. A voice that sounds like it is carrying the exact weight of everything that was done to it, and is still impossibly beautiful. What the recordings reveal about the original structure is this: the voice was the only thread that was entirely hers. Every other thread had run through someone else's hands. The financial thread ran through managers and club owners. The professional thread ran through the NYPD's licensing office. The independence thread ran through the daily possibility of refusal, which the habit had eroded. But the voice was hers in a way that none of the others were. And what survived was exactly what no one else had been able to hold. The second surviving thread was strange fruit. Not just the recording, the fact of it. She sang it from 1939 until she could not sing anymore. Harry Anslinger had spent 15 years and the resources of a federal bureau on one objective: silencing a black woman singing a song about lynching to white audiences. He failed. She sang it at Carnegie Hall after prison. She sang it in Europe when America had closed its clubs to her. She sang it until her body gave out. When she died, he wrote, for her, there would be no more good morning heartache. He had known all along that this was personal. The selective enforcement is documented. When it was brought to Anslinger's attention that Judy Garland was also a heroin addict, he wrote MGM and suggested she take longer vacations. The drug war was a tool. Billie Holiday was the target. Strange fruit was the reason. What he destroyed tells you what he wanted gone. What survived tells you what he could not reach. The third surviving thread is the smallest. Jimmy Fletcher was the black federal agent Anslinger assigned to infiltrate Holiday's Harlem world in the early 1940s. He wore his serviceman's uniform and posed as a fan. He was young. He believed, or told himself he believed, that drug addiction was self-victimization. He had said something close to that, and it may have been what allowed him to take the assignment. Anslinger did not hire black agents as a rule, but he needed one who could move in Harlem without drawing attention, and Fletcher was the man he chose. Fletcher documented her drinking and her drug use. He was present in her neighborhood over years, in her social world, in rooms where she was unguarded. He danced with her at Club Ebony. Multiple independent biographical sources describe what developed between them as genuine closeness. Possibly love on his part, though the record does not confirm what she felt about a man she did not know was being paid to watch her. And then he led the raid. He knocked on her hotel room door in Philadelphia pretending to have a telegram to deliver. He brought agents into the room. He watched her strip in front of them, a deliberate act by her of refusing to be processed like contraband, and he watched them photograph her on the floor and take her into custody. Decades later, journalist Linda Lipnack-Kuehl, who spent 8 years finding and interviewing everyone who had known Billie Holiday, tracked Fletcher down. Kuehl asked directly whether a star like Holiday would have been a target because an arrest would generate publicity for the Bureau. He conceded, not just for an agent, for the Bureau of Narcotics. In the fuller interview, preserved in fragmentary form before the original tape was lost by the archive holding it, he said, I had so many close conversations with her about so many things. She was the type who would make anyone sympathetic because she was the loving type. He had loved her. The man assigned to destroy her had loved her and done the job anyway. He expressed regret. The record does not tell us what he did with it, or whether it was the kind of regret that costs something in the spending or the kind that merely acknowledges a debt and closes the account. The testimony survived regardless. That is the one remaining thread. The words of the man paid to